Can you hear me? Okay. I am in some locations called Reverend John Case. Part of the reason for wearing this shirt is to commemorate almost 2 years ago when MCC closed here in Fort Collins. I was the pastor at that point in time. But as Father's Day, I loved the fact that what they might sometimes call the original Paul, the loving Paul, was the author of the scripture that you used today. Now with me and our son, I recognized in him a growing depression. And one night, it was too big to ignore. And so I said, we've got to talk. Typical? His answer was, I'm too busy today. I said, I understand. You see, he was working at an interior design degree up in CSU. He also had a full-time job and was actually a person who had the perception that he could tell colors and tones of paint better than the machines could. And so I wound up telling him, if we don't talk now, you're either going to hurt yourself or hurt somebody else trying to hurt yourself. You see, I had learned to watch for the warning signs of suicide ideation. So he was at that point. Said, okay, let's talk. Then the famous quote that I use, he says, okay, as he sat down at the top of the stairs in our two-story and said, go get Mom, because I'm only going to say this once. And he began, which is normal, what I've learned, I think I might be gay. To age myself, the first thought that came into my mind was an old phrase called circle the wagons, because I knew that there was danger in that being. And as we went through the process, it's about 1.5 years, 2 years after that, he dressed in a dress during coming out day at CSU. He was so good, he was on the front page of the Collegiate. What that did was let his two brothers know. His twin brother was okay. His older brother, not so much. You see, I had been raised in a very, very conservative church. I had actually been a minister there at that particular point in time, about 33 years. And so our son was given the opportunity to either go back in the closet or leave the church. He says, I want to fight, Dad. And I said, I know, but let Dad fight this one. He said, you have too much tied into getting your degree, to being you. You don't have the emotional or the physical strength to do it all. He said, okay. I said, go ahead and write your letter of resignation, and I'll fight it as long as they let me. 2 years later, two leaders of that church asked to spend the night at our place. So they had dinner, they had breakfast, then they told my wife she needed to leave the house. And then they sat across the kitchen table from me and told me that I had been silenced as a minister, I could no longer serve, and that if I was a good boy and continued with what they wanted, I might get my ministry back. Then they asked about my membership. At that particular point in time, and trying to make sense out of being gay and support, my wife and I had joined PFLAG. In fact, it was at a point where I had been invited to join the board, but I was kind of pushing back. I said, okay, if I continue my work with PFLAG, would I be considered a member in good standing? Now there they have a closed communion. You're not in good standing, you don't get communion. And they say, no, PFLAG's an enemy to the church. So, make a long story short, 2 weeks later, I was on the board of PFLAG Fort Collins. 2 months later, I was on the board of Lambda Community Center. What I learned through that was a love I don't think I'd ever experienced before. Because I was working, I was going through that, I was trying to learn more and more, and it was season of Pride. Not during Pride, we were just getting started on planning. And so I happened to leave work, get up to Fort Collins, and work for me at that point in time was the IBM location in Boulder. And so I got there a little early, and I was exhausted. So they just threw me a pillow and said, lean over into the corner. It'll be a while, and we'll wake you up. Well, when I did wake up, instead of a room that had about 3 people in it, there was probably 40 people there. And they were just getting started talking about Pride. What I noticed right off the bat was I had a feeling of perfect safety and peace. In a room full of gays, lesbians, and transgender people. That evening, I fell in love with the group. That was perfect safety in a very, very closed facility. And the first thing that I have started to try to do is how do we expand out of small areas? To me, as a father, that's what you do. You try to make it easier, not only for your kids, but the kids that look at you as a father figure. Needless to say, Lambda Community Center is no more. I was selected as one of 3 that we actually worked to try to go ahead and start a new organization. Instead of a new organization, we wound up working in Denver. What used to be the GLBT Center of Denver became the GLBT Center of Colorado, and they opened a chapter up here. It only lasted about 2.5 years. Won't get into the reasons why, but it happened. Then, as luck would have it, I was making a shift, saying, okay, how can I not only work in the physical and the nonprofit area, but also start addressing the spiritual area as well? Because one thing I haven't mentioned is as I left the church, I still held on to this idea that God and that church were tied together. I wound up going to Isla School of Theology. Got my master's in divinity. What I learned through my internship, and it was an interesting one. Up here, I was going with the ministry of the Center for Spiritual Living. Down in Colorado Springs, I was interning with MCC. As the old pastor at MCC in Fort Collins said, you're going to come out very, very progressive. One of the things I had learned, even before the kids came along, was every 2 years, you really need to sit down and say, okay, what have I learned? First step. Second step, how do I apply it to my current belief system? That's where you grow. That's where you get that freedom. And so, from my point of view, I know I'm running short on time. I will just end with this. When does that fight finish? It doesn't finish for everyone at the same time. But from my perspective, when you no longer have new experiences, no longer learn, and so you can't take that learning and apply it to you, that's when your end of the fight finishes. But I think it is part of God's plan. We always have something to learn because we were created to be more than we realize. Thank you.